Alonso had only been appointed governor of India 2 months earlier, after emerging from what was effectively house arrest by the previous Viceroy Francisco de Almeida, who had already left India to return to Portugal. On January 2nd, 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque had maneuvered his fleet into position southwest of the city of Calut. His ship's cannons were primed, and his men, exhausted from their lengthy voyage from Goa, were prepared for any hostile action. The Marshal of Portugal, D. Fernando Coutinho, arrived shortly after. He was a young, cocky, ambitious man who was desperate for glory, but he was also conceited, reckless, and, some would say, foolhardy. He was also inexperienced in comparison to Albuquerque, particularly when it came to military tactics and strategy. Despite the fact that the Marshal had arrived with a fleet of 15 ships and 3,000 men, making him the de facto Portuguese commander in the Indian Ocean, Coutinho was, as he approached Alonso, who was also his cousin, he was determined to make this point clear. The Marshal declared that he would destroy Cal and its king, the Zamorin, in one blow. Alonso was dubious about this plan, but he had to accept an attack on the city if honor required it. The plan called for Coutinho to attack with a larger force from the north of the city, while Albuquerque would approach from the south as a more diversionary attack, in which the two men would have to land. In a two-pronged attack, the two pincers would advance on the Surame, a magnificently ornate royal pavilion. Its impressive doors, which were intricately carved and inlaid with gold, silver, and jewels, were to be the Marshal's trophies. He, and only he, would have the honor of seizing the doors, and he, and only he, would personally deliver them to King Manuel. The first glory was there for the taking. All they had to do was flawlessly carry out their military operation on January 3rd, 1510, 2 hours before dawn. Coutinho's flagship lit a signal fire, and more than 1,500 men, all dressed in armor and eager for loot, made their way to shore on the Marshal. However, they were unaware of the potentially dangerous water currents, and their contingent was carried far north of their intended landing zone, which caused the schedule to be delayed in Albuquerque. They attempted to keep their men in line to make up for this delay, but discipline was necessary, was overpowered by the need for plunder, and faced with a possible breakdown in his formation. So Alonso decided to attack. He shouted his battle cry, Santiago, and his men charged forward. The defenders of Calicut rushed out to engage, and fierce fighting broke out all along the beach. Albert responded to this counterattack by having his ship fire broadsides into his crowded enemies. With naval support, the defenders broke and ran, and Albuquerque's soldiers pushed on into the city, fighting skillfully from house to house and from street to street. In the meantime, the Marshal and his men, burdened by their bulky armor, were still marching along the beach when they heard the gunfire, explosions, and fighting. Fernando Coutinho was incensed that his cousin would attempt to attack without him, but his rage was only going to flare when he finally reached the royal pavilion and discovered that the renowned exotic doors of the Saram, his prize, had not only been cut out, but had already been packed up and taken back to a ship. Now, remember that Albuquerque had done this more for safekeeping than to steal the honor or glory, because his men were in the middle of a feverish looting frenzy, and the Portuguese men were essentially stealing or destroying anything that wasn't already on fire. However, this didn't matter to the Marshal, who exploded in rage after being denied his trophy. Albuquerque attempted to calm him down and reason with him, but at this point, Coutinho was filled with rage and would roar back asking, "What is this, Alonso de Albuquerque? Your words mean nothing more than air. This honor is your doors, and I want none of it." At that point, the marshal ordered the hard doors to be thrown into the sea. D. Fernando Coutinho needed something even more to fulfill his honor, so he called in Gaspar de Gama, now known as Gaspar the Almeida. Gaspar was a multi-talented man who was known for his intelligence, charm, and, most importantly, his ability to survive, spoke at least 6 languages, and was a true international man of mystery. By chance, he knew the way to the Zamorin Palace, which was situated in the jungle about 3 miles east of Calicut. Although it was a treacherous route, the palace also housed the King of Cut's enormous treasury. Albuquerque knew this was a very bad idea, and he attempted to reason with the marshal once more. A chronicler remembered him saying, quote, "I beg of you, for pity's sake, don't take that road from here to the king's houses. It's a long way, the roads are bad, and men can only go in single file. You will get into a lot of trouble getting there, and when you get there, you'll be exhausted. There, you'll find many of these well-armed and highly spirited Niar warriors. I'm telling you the truth, and I humbly ask you not to go." It was a good warning, rational of thought, which was obviously interpreted as a challenge and a threat to the young fat commander, who, with 400 men and a small contingent, he immediately entered the jungle to seek his glory. Albuquerque had no choice but to follow, which went against all of his knowledge and experience. He would tell his men, "We must be ready today, we will see what God wills," because many of the people he saw leaving would not return. The road was exactly as Afonso had described, long, winding, narrow, and flanked by jungle. The Portuguese men had to walk in single file by this point, and Calicut was also engulfed in flames as the smoke that blew. As the marshal proceeded east, which reduced the already poor visibility to 0, he started to run into the Zamorin Nar warriors, in small groups at first, but resistance increased as they got closer to the palace. Nevertheless, Coutinho remained resolute, and, in spite of suffering heavy losses, he eventually reached his destination. When they got there, a fierce battle broke out, but Portuguese steel was superior, and the palace guards were swiftly routed. The Zamorin's treasury was now open for looting. Roger Crowley, in his book The Conquerors, explain what transpired next. The looting started. Locks were broken off with axes. Inside was an Aladdin's cave. There were chests filled with rich clothing made of silk and gold thread, velour, and Arabian brocades, as well as wooden reliquaries adorned with gold and silver. The Fidos had their servants stack their private stashes, guarding them jealously in a fiercely competitive grab for the opportunity to become fabulously wealthy, sweeping away any caution they had left, their lances and weapons outside the better to gather armfuls of prizes for 2 hours. The looters did not see what was about to happen, and as the day grew hotter, the Nayar warriors had enough time to reorganize and bring in reinforcements. By the time Afonso de Albuquerque arrived, the Portuguese were greatly outnumbered, and the counterattack had already started. Afonso ordered his men to guard the road back to the city, and he then hurried into the palace to the Portuguese, then started to retreat, with Afonso and his men taking the lead, Fernando's men taking up the rear guard, and the marshal himself entering at the very end of the procession with his cannons, keeping the Nars at bay. The Zamorin men expertly used the jungle for cover and brought down several trees to block the road. Fernando Coutinho, his cousin, was persuaded to leave immediately after a lengthy SL argument, but only agreed to leave if he was the last to leave for his honor. When the Nars realized that their opponents had lost their heavy weapons, they unleashed and launched an all-out attack on Coutinho, who was exhausted in his plate armor. He and his men were soon overpowered by a vicious Nar from behind, who discovered the large man's Achilles heel in his plate mail. The slash severed the man's foot completely, and the marshal's men made a futile attempt to pull him back up, but they themselves were defeated. Were quickly encircled, and when the dust finally settled, the Nars took their heads and banners as prizes. Albuquerque, meanwhile, had returned to the city and was overseeing a last-ditch defense on the beach when he learned that his cousin, the Marshal of Portugal, had fallen. He made a valiant effort to rally his men to return and retrieve the body, but nobody volunteered to do so. In fact, he watched Portuguese soldiers from the footmen's ranks. Albuquerque realized that the expedition was seriously jeopardized when he saw the Fidalgo pouring out of the jungle in mass panic, with the Nars right behind them. As the Portuguese fled, they threw their weapons and armor to the sides, realizing that he was now in charge and that he would not have time to assume command for long. An arrow struck him in the arm, then in the neck, and a minute later, a bullet struck him in the chest, causing him to collapse to, as night fell, the remaining Portuguese fled to the safety of their ships, where they were shielded by their cannons. The casualties of a Coutinho's reckless charge were enormous, with 300 men dead and 400 wounded, the majority of whom would later die from their wounds. In total, nearly a third of their force had been destroyed. It was later determined that 70 noblemen had been killed, and it was believed that Gaspar, although the Almea was one of the fallen, his death was never verified, and according to some accounts, he lived for another 10 years in a different country. For the Zamorin, the situation was even worse. Over 2,000 men had been killed or wounded, and large parts of his city had been reduced to ash. The merchant ships in the harbor, which were his primary source of income, had also been miraculously destroyed, and every night, Alonso de Albuquerque would awaken in the captain's quarters aboard his flagship. Drenched in his own blood, the arrow in his arm and neck had been carefully removed, and the bleeding had stopped. Despite this, his doctors had initially believed he wouldn't survive, but amazingly, the wound to his chest was not fatal. His doctor would eventually remove the bullet, and again, luck would not allow infection to set in. Nevertheless, Alonso would live from that day on, with limited strength in his left arm and a newfound respect for death. Over the next few days, he would regain his strength and go immediately. The majority of the Portuguese forces would fall into Alonso's lap 12 after the marshal's death, and the 15 ships that Coutinho had brought would now be under his command. Albuquerque now had a substantial force, and for the first time the governor of India was able to music govern the Dabaka. However, Calicut would serve as a continual reminder to Alonso de Albuquerque that using force was not always the best course of action. Nevertheless, Alonso and his king Manuel Victor shared the belief that Portugal. The governor went to work and devised a daring new plan because Portugal was a small country with a small population, which meant it lacked the manpower to field large armies and hold massive tracks. The governor knew that resources were limited, and that the Indian Ocean was a brutal theater of operations that bled men and material dry. Alonso's brush with death also instilled in him the notion that time was short. Like some of his predecessors, Alonso had concluded that controlling strategic points on the map was a better way to go than building a large land empire. If those areas could be subjugated, Portuguese power could be extended and exerted almost everywhere else. Albuquerque was eager to start his strategy, but he was unaware at the time that he was going to lead one of the greatest conquests in history: music. Afonso was a brilliant man, not only in terms of strategic vision, but also, first and foremost, the governor began to appease his king. In contrast to his predecessor, Almeida Albuquerque, who would constantly send Manuel information to support his every action and, when needed, boost the king's ego. Second, he ensured that the spice fleets met their quotas and returned to Lisbon, keeping the royal treasury full, if not overflowing. Third, he took control of everything in his theater of operations because the King of Portugal was afraid of a coup, had split the leadership of the Indian Ocean into 3 distinct commands. Albuquerque was, in theory, in charge of the central region, which included the western coast of India, but Africa, the lands, and the islands to the east, including Malacca, had their own commander. Although this division prevented anyone from becoming overly powerful, it also hindered the Portuguese's ability to expand further, because no one had enough force, and knew he could not defy His Majesty's regulations regarding a divided leadership at the same time. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. In the end, he decided that he was going to bend the rules a little bit, if not completely, to his advantage. He did this by skillfully and covertly persuading the other 2 commanders to pool all of their power, bringing the otherwise dispersed military under one supreme command, which would ultimately be him. The governor then went to work reviving the military. Roger Crowley explains why the change was necessary. The massacre served as a reminder of the shortcomings of the Portuguese military code, which valued individual heroic deeds over tactics. Albuquerque was well aware of the military revolution that was sweeping the Atlantic, and the Portuguese fought with a ferocity that stunned the peoples of the Indian Ocean, but their methods were medieval, chaotic, and occasionally suicidal. During the Italian wars in the late 15th century, professional Swiss mercenaries trained to march and fight throughout Europe. His organized groups had revolutionized battlefield tactics, steamrolling their opponents in tight, massed formation, with highly maneuverable columns armed with pikes and halberds. The governor, filled with zeal, set about reorganizing and teaching his men the tactics and disciplines of this new warfare, turning Cochin into a military camp where troops were trained to march. Portuguese strength would now shift toward the goal of using organization and discipline rather than the need for honor, though it would take some time before this mentality was fully integrated. The fleet's ships were also fully refitted, and by early February of 1510, Alonso had 23 ships with 1,600 soldiers and several thousand mercenaries. Albuquerque was now prepared to start his campaigns of conquest, but the real question was where he would start. Albuquerque sailed out of Cochin and then north along the coast the year before, but he kept his true destination a secret from everyone. By February 13, 1510, he was anchored off the coast of Aneda Island as his men were taking on fresh water. It was reported that the Sultan had his shipyards working day and night. The Mamluk were reportedly eager to exact revenge for their devastating defeat at the Battle of Dhu. A Hindu pirate named Timmy had fought his way up the ranks, had a formidable reputation, and was well versed in everything that happened along the Indian coast. He had previously encountered the Portuguese before meeting Vasco da Gama, and, although he initially attempted to kill him, he was impressed by the commander. A few years later, At the city of Anavar Uji, he had seen Francisco de Almeida and his son Lorenzo unleash the destructive power of the Portuguese armada. The wire pirate had made the decision to support the Europeans right away, and had been a useful informant ever since. He now informed Albuquerque that the Mamluk had sought safety in a nearby city, where they were constructing not only a new fleet, but also an army. He also explained that the majority of the city's residents were Hindu, but that the Muslims in charge had taxed them heavily, so the populace was prepared to rebel, and all they needed was a little direction from Timi. Additionally, he noted that the city had one of India's most impressive deep-water ports, and that it was strategically located on an island between two rivers, giving it a defensive edge. Afonso had originally planned to travel to the Red Sea, but instead he set out for a place where the Portuguese, somewhat ironically, had completely ignored his Portuguese armada. The city of Goa was the next stop on its route, and glory awaited him there.